Hello, everyone. Welcome to our December seminar. This is our faculty seminar series here in the High Meadows Environmental Institute. My name is Mike Celia. I'm director of the Institute. And I think for the last time, I'll give you a reminder that as of about a month ago, we changed our name. So those who have followed us for the previous 25 years would know us as the Princeton Environmental Institute, and we're now the High Meadows Environmental Institute. We continue with our faculty seminar series, which is what we're offering today. I'll remind you it's the first Tuesday of each month. And I'll also remind you that as we've done since we've gone online with remote offerings, in addition to today's speaker, who as you know is Professor Jonathan Levine, we'll also have a discussant who will join the conversation and moderate the questions and participate in the discussion after Jonathan finishes his talk. And today's discussant is Professor Corina Tarnita, also from the EEB department, Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here at Princeton. I'll remind you that all of you in the audience are welcome to submit questions at any time during the talk or after the talk. You do that by using the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. The chat function has been disabled for participants, so you need to use the Q&A function in the Zoom software. And also, just as a reminder, today's seminar is being recorded. All right, well, now I get to have the pleasure to introduce today's speaker, our colleague and good friend, Jonathan Levine. Professor Levine is in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology here at Princeton. He's also an affiliated faculty member in the High Meadows Environmental Institute. Jonathan is an ecologist who combines theory and modeling with some really interesting field measurements and observations to study a range of important topics, including things like species diversity and species coexistence, plant migration and invasion, and as you'll see from the title of today's talk, he also looks at how communities respond to climate change. Jonathan's work has been recognized in a number of ways with a range of honors and awards. As usual, I'll only mention a few of them. For example, he received the George Mercer Award for an outstanding paper by an ecologist under the age of 40. A really significant achievement to do it once. He actually received the award twice for two different papers he published in the journal Science. He's been recognized as a highly cited researcher in environment and ecology. For those who follow this, you'll know that that really is a big deal based on Web of Science citations. And recently, meaning last year, 2019, Jonathan was elected a fellow of the Ecological Society of America, ESA. He currently serves as editor of the journal Ecological Letters. And before that, he'd served for more than 10 years as editor of Ecology and Ecological Monographs. Here at Princeton, he's the director for undergraduate studies in the EEB department, Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And within HMEI, he's part of the leadership team for this large multidisciplinary project we have that we call the Carbon Mitigation Initiative, or CMI. So with that, I invite all of you to give a very big virtual welcome to today's speaker, Professor Jonathan Levine. Jonathan, I hand the screen to you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Mike, for that very kind introduction. And I'm very excited to talk with you today and really, in many ways, introduce myself to the broader High Meadows Environmental Institute community as we have here at Princeton. So I'm going to get my screen up. Okay, so as Mike mentioned, I'm a professor in ecology and evolutionary biology here at Princeton. I've been here for a little under 2 years. So I'm still in many ways getting to know many of you here in our broader environment community. And I should also say it's a great privilege to be giving this talk and to be a professor here at Princeton. So I want to begin with the tension that I think characterizes much of ecology today, in the sense that we have a discipline that kind of has sort of two parents. On the one hand, we have a motivation for our science that is resting in this fundamental curiosity about how nature operates. And this is sort of typified by the explorations of the naturalists of the 19th century who would try and explain the amazing diversity they encountered in sort of these far off regions, for them at least. And certainly the work in our group has elements of this sort of tradition. And this tradition is very strong here at Princeton in the sense that Robert MacArthur and Robert May in the 70s were sort of really building on this kind of way in which ecology could grow. But at the same time, we also have an ecology that's motivated by pressing environmental challenges. And we have problems like climate change or the spread of biological invasions or the emergence of infectious diseases, which are taking central places in the mainstream ecological journals, but I think more importantly, are taking central places in the motivations of the students that we attract to our labs. And this really in many ways sort of foreshadows what our discipline might look like in 20 years' time, for example. So what I want to do today is describe some of the work that we've been doing, focusing on the problem of how plant communities will respond to one of these environmental challenges, climate change. But in so doing, what I want to illustrate for you is potentially the power of trying to essentially move back and forth between these two types of motivations for our science, and illustrate how, in many ways, a fundamental curiosity about how competition works might be instrumental towards properly addressing the future of plant communities in a variety of interesting habitats. Okay, so widespread recognition of the fact that climate is changing across the globe, both in terms of temperature, as we see in the panel up here, as well as in terms of precipitation, has motivated many ecologists to go to the field and do experiments like the one you see here, where we go to nature and try and mimic some future climate condition. In this case, it's a rainout shelter trying to mimic a drier climate in California. And there's literally been thousands of these experiments at this point, identifying impacts of climate on populations, on communities, as well as on sort of biogeochemical cycles and ecosystems. And it can be challenging in many ways to try and sort of take home some clear messages from this work. But one of them that really excites me as a community ecologist, someone who studies the interaction between different species, is that when we try and ask what are the major pathways through which climate has impacts on the fates of species we care about or the fates of biodiversity, it's often not just the effects that climate has on the ecophysiology or demography of a species we might care about, but also, or sometimes even more so, the indirect effects of climate on focal species that emerge via the alteration of the competitive environment in which species are found. And I think this makes a lot of sense. But if you leave with one message from the talk today, it's that what we think we understand about these indirect effects of climate change on the fate of biodiversity is really just the tip of the iceberg. And it's the tip of the iceberg for a very practical reason, which is that we as ecologists have been very good at trying to study how climate might alter the interactions between species that co-occur today. Those, for example, that are currently found underneath one of these rainout shelters. That's obviously for very practical reasons. They're already there, they're already interacting. But if you think about what might be the greatest impacts of changing competition, for example, under climate change, I think it's very reasonable to expect that some of the largest impacts will come not from changing interactions with plants that already co-occur, but in fact, the arrival of entirely new competitors in the system that migrate in as the climate here becomes newly suitable for them. These kinds of novel competitive interactions could really play important roles in shaping the fates of the species that we see in these habitats. So let me flesh out what I mean by these novel competitive interactions in a graphic. So you can imagine that you're looking at the distribution of species along an environmental gradient in this cartoon. And the environmental gradient can conveniently be thought of as altitude or elevation in an alpine system. So we have different species distributions indicated by different sort of colors of histogram along this elevational gradient or environmental gradient. And right now, there are some interactions between species that are adjacent and some species simply are too far away along that gradient to actually compete in the current environment. Now, if we now envision a climate change that's going to essentially make locations that are found at one end of the environmental gradient now found further up the gradient, let's say up here, we of course expect the species to migrate to essentially match this region of shifting climate suitability. But it's important to think about the fact that these species do not have comparable capacities to migrate. Some are going to be very essentially good at dispersing. Others are going to be much poorer at making offspring. And what this does is create variation among species and how fast they can essentially move to track this shifting region of climate suitability. Thus, what we expect is maybe a consistent direction of migration across the taxa. But some taxa, like the red one, will have migrated very effectively, while others, like the blue one, will migrate ineffectively. And what this does in the future environment, shown here, is create an interaction between species that actually don't interact in today's environment. And thus the fate of the blue one depends very much on how it interacts potentially with the arrival of novel taxa like these red ones. And this is what I'm basically calling novel competitive interactions for the purposes of this presentation. Now, I think a fair bit of ecological natural history, as well as actually an emerging body of theory, would lead us to think that these novel competitive interactions could really play decisive roles in shaping the future of biodiversity under climate change. But our empirical validation of this sort of central proposition is quite poor. So what I want to do today is build a talk around these novel competitive interactions and share with you work that we have done on this topic and kind of where we're headed in this topic over the next few years. And I want to address several questions, and they're interrelated. The first one is, how do novel competitors shape species responses to climate change? So will, for example, the arrival of that red competitor ultimately do the blue competitor in? And then secondly, I want to ask, what's the relative importance of these different types of indirect effects that can emerge under climate change? On the one hand, we might be thinking about these novel competitive interactions, which can essentially change the composition of species that a focal species might face under climate change. On the other hand, we might have simply changing interactions between the current competitors that a species faces. So we might see different kinds of competition and different kinds of competitive outcomes emerging just among the plants that a focal species might face today. And we really want to get a handle on kind of what is the relative importance of these two different drivers of climate change impacts on biodiversity. Okay, so making headway in these sets of questions is quite challenging. I mean, at some level, I think it's quite intuitive to expect that these novel interactions could be quite important. But as I said, we don't have good empirical validation of this proposition. And why is that? Well, I think the answer is actually just quite practical. On the one hand, we have poor predictions for which novel interactions will emerge in the future. So if I'm standing, for example, in a meadow here in Princeton, and I look at the species at my feet, and I say, who will those plants be competing with in the future in 100 years' time? It's not a trivial question to answer that with any confidence. I mean, I might say, well, maybe I should go to areas that today have Princeton's climate of the future, and that might give me a good lens. But even then, it's not clear that those plants will be able to migrate the kilometers necessary to sort of end up in the meadow at my feet. And then secondly, even if we have a good sense of which plants might interact with one another in the future, sort of to provide a good context for asking the question, it can be experimentally challenging to actually create those interactions today. This is not something that's easy to do. And of course, you have to do so in the climate of the future. So there's a variety of sort of logistical challenges that get in the way of sort of getting some good empirical teeth on these novel competitive interactions and their potential impacts. So I've been working for about the last 8 years with a couple postdocs, former postdocs, I should say, Jake Alexander and Jeff Dietz, who are now professors in Switzerland and in California, taking advantage of the steep elevation gradients and climate gradients that you have in mountains to try and make progress on this problem. And mountains are really ideal for overcoming the hurdles I laid out for the following reasons. So namely, this is our field site here, and we're looking at the habitat that we study. This is our focal system at around 2,000 meters. This is just above tree line in the Swiss Alps. And the plants that you see in this foreground here, they already are experiencing warming, but they'll experience significant warming over the current century. Interestingly, you will find a climate comparable to what you see at 2,000 meters today in 100 years' time, assuming 3 degrees of temperature increase, around the top of this ridge here. So about 600 meters upslope, you will essentially find a climate that's 3 degrees cooler. So if the climate warms 3 degrees, we should find a comparable climate as what we have here, simply up here. It gives us some good expectations about which plants might actually compete with one another in this current century. So it's not entirely unreasonable these plants could migrate the distance that's required to achieve this sort of climate stasis. So this at least gives us some good sort of scenarios that we might want to examine for future competition for any focal species in this system. The other hurdle, if you recall, was sort of the tractability of trying to create those interactions today and doing so under the future climate. Well, it turns out that the alpine meadows that you're seeing are amazingly transplantable. So you can basically dig them out of the ground intact, and they don't seem to mind too much. So essentially, you can take out a large intact community, and you can move that community to different points along the altitudinal gradient. And what this does is it allows you to break apart the current association between climate and competition. And therefore, you can expose a focal species that you might plant into one of these plots to whatever combination of climate or competition that you like. And this is very important for beginning to examine these sort of novel configurations of climate and competition that might emerge in the future. And this is essentially what we did. So we thought very hard about which kinds of scenarios we wanted to examine to create in these different scenarios of climate and competitor change. And I'm showing you these 4 scenarios in the slide here, and I'll walk you through this slide slowly. So please just pay attention to what this green individual plant is doing. So here's a plant that is currently found at around 2,000 meters, and it currently lives at a climate that's depicted in yellow, and it's found with a certain set of competitors shown by this yellow color as well. Further down the slope at around 1,400 meters, 3 degrees warmer in climate, basically, we have a novel low elevation community of plants. And further up the slope at around 2,600 meters, we have a higher alpine system of plants, which again are basically novel to our focal species that's found at around 2,000 meters. Now, we have different scenarios of competitor change that this focal plant might face, depending on how it and its competitors migrate. So we have 2 scenarios that emerge if the focal species fails to migrate. Or another way of saying this is if you're looking at the trailing edge of the range for this focal species. So the back end as it's migrating upslope under climate change. On the one hand, it might face its current competitors if they too also essentially stay in place. And thus it will have a different competitive environment because it'll be warmer, and certainly competition can change as a function of the warming temperatures. But the identity of those competitors will be roughly the same. The alternative competitive environment that I want you to think about is one where the low elevation plants themselves are able to migrate upslope to track their shifting region of climate suitability. And now the focal plant is surrounded by these low elevation competitors. And thus the key question that I want to boil the talk down to is, does it matter for the fates of these focal plants under a warmer climate, whether they face their current competitors or these competitors that might migrate in from lower elevation? Now, we have a different set of scenarios that emerge in cases where the focal plant is migrating upslope, or alternatively, if you're looking at the leading edge of its expanding range. Here, if the focal plant is the only one or the first one to get to the habitat high up, it will now be facing a novel set of high elevation competitors that it doesn't face in its current environment. Alternatively, all of its current competitors might pack their bags along with it and migrate upslope. And this might lead to a situation where the focal plant is actually competing with its current competitors and its current climate, actually, just in a different spatial location in the future. So these are, of course, extreme cases that are meant to bookend the problem. But this is kind of our first stab at trying to address how these novel competitive interactions might influence the dynamics of an alpine plant species whose range is shifting under climate change. So as I've already alluded to, what we did was we created these 4 different scenarios in today's alpine environment. And the basic approach involved transplanting focal species individuals. So you can basically cut individual plants out of the ground They're vegetatively reproducing perennials, so you can cut them out of the ground with a knife, and then you can plug them in to different competitive and climate environments that might emerge under different migration scenarios. So for example, to create scenario 1, where our focal 2,000-meter plant, we're looking at the trailing edge of its range, or it's failed to advance its range altogether, and it's found with its current set of competitors, albeit under the warmer climate of the future. What we did was we took multiple individuals of these focal plants, cut them out of the ground, planted them into half-meter square plots that you can see here, that were composed of the current competitors of those species. So we didn't choose the exact same plot from which we cut out the focal plants, but we chose other areas that were found at around 2,000 meters to find an equivalent type of plant community. And then because that interaction takes place in the warmer climate of the future, or in the future would take place under a warmer climate, we then transplant the entire focal plant embedded in the competitor plot down to 1,400 meters to subject it to 3 degrees of climate warming. And then, of course, we did that with all of the different scenarios that you see in the slide. So, for example, to do scenario 3, where the focal plant is found in the future with this novel high alpine community, albeit under the current climate of the focal plant, because it was able to migrate in a way that tracks its current climate. What we do is we take focal plant individuals, plant them into plots of these novel high alpine communities, and because that system is essentially one that would occur at the current climate for the focal plant, we place the entire system at 2,000 meters, matching the current climate for the focal plant. So you can trust me that we did all this correctly. At least no one's found a problem since we published it. But we basically created these 4 different scenarios experimentally is the point. So it was actually a really fun project, and to kind of leave you with some visually arresting imagery, I'm going to actually show you a video of actually how we do this work, because it's quite, in many ways, humorous, at least. So I'm going to try and do this with the online YouTube interface. I hope this is working. And what you can see is that the community basically comes out of the ground like a sod. It's remarkable in a way. And so what we basically do is we pry them out of the ground by getting underneath the rooting zone, and they're quite heavy, as you can imagine. So what we do is we basically roll them. And so if I can fast forward a little bit, what we end up doing is we basically pull them far enough, we try and smooth them so they're at an even depth of soil. And then eventually, we have enough strength in our team to basically roll them onto a tarp, which allows us now to pick them up and move them around. So these are quite heavy. I can't remember how much they weigh, but it was an ungodly amount of weight. But 4 people could pick them up and move them around. The obvious question is, how do you now get them to different elevations? Because you don't want to carry them or put them into a vehicle. It's not accessible to do that. So what we do is we basically stack them about 4 tall, and we put them into these large helicopter bags. And then the helicopter comes along and picks them up and brings them from high elevation down to our sunny low elevation site, as you can see here, where it's warmer, at least today. And then once the helicopter lets these things down, we then can unpack them and place them into the warmer climate of the future for at least some of these plant species. Okay, so that's what we do. So what I want to show you first are the results from the first set of scenarios. These are the scenarios where the focal plant is migrating, is actually failing to migrate, or we're looking at the trailing edge of its range. And what I hope you can see is that we have 2 different scenarios that will emerge under this warming scenario for our focal plant. It might face its current competitors under this scenario, or it might face novel low elevation competitors that would migrate in. So here are the results. What you can see, actually, hold on one second. What you can see here are the results of our transplants, individual plants' fate, when they compete with their current community, where the results are shown in yellow, versus when they compete with the novel low elevation community that might migrate in under warmer climate. Their results are shown in orange. And I'm showing you the survival after 2 years of being planted into these plots for 4 different focal plants. We didn't just use one, we used 4. All of these plants have a range which is centered around 2,000 meters. They don't go up to 2,600 meters. They don't go down to 1,400 meters, at least on our sites. So these competitors truly are novel to them. It doesn't matter what these species are, but you can imagine, for those of you who are more botany inclined, we have an Anthillus, we have a Plantago, we have a Pulsatilla, and we have a Scabiosa. These are very common alpine plants. And what you can see is that for 3 of the 4 focal alpine species, their survival after 2 years of being in these competitive environments under warmer climates is much less when they're growing with this low elevation competitor than when they're growing with their current sets of competitors. And it's not just survival that goes down. The other sort of key demographic rate is reproduction. And in this case, we see the probability of flowering for all 4 of these species, actually for 3 of the 4 species, I should say, also declined when we expose them to these novel low elevation competitive environments. So the point is that we now have some good empirical validation of the principle that these low elevation competitors can play decisive roles in shaping the fates of biodiversity in the alpine. And this is an important thing to know. At the same time, you might also be thinking, I might have guessed this, because all that I've really showed you is that these plants basically compete much more poorly with the competitors which are currently found in the climates of the future, those that are in orange, versus those that are actually found in cooler climates, those which produce the yellow bars in our focal plants. And that's correct. But in fact, it's not so simple. And we did not actually see that simple pattern emerge when we looked at the alternative scenarios where the focal plant is successfully advancing its range, or we're looking at the leading edge of its range. So remember, here it might face this novel high alpine community if it's the only plant that migrates upslope, or it might face its current community if all of its current competitors migrate along with it. Okay, so here's the results of this set of scenarios. And what you can see is that all 4 of these species, they first of all have high survivorship, but their survivorship doesn't really depend on whether they're competing with their current competitors, shown in yellow, or competing with the novel high alpine competitors where the results are shown in blue. And it's not just true for survival, it's also true for probability of flowering. 3 of the 4 species show no influence of the competitive environment of the identity of the competitors on their flowering probability. One of them does seem to show a response. The Anthillus here, it does seem to be flowering much more when it's with this novel high alpine community. But in fact, we were able to show that this result was not driven by a shift in competitor abundance, but instead was driven by, in fact, the soils that necessarily came along with those competitors. So another way of saying is that we can reproduce this exact result here with no competitors at all if we simply grow the Anthillus on the soils of the 2 different elevations. So we believe this is a direct response to soils, not a response to competition. I'll actually come back to these bare soil plots in a moment. Okay, so to summarize what I've showed you in these sort of first few data slides, it's that in the scenarios where the focal plant fails to migrate upslope, we see very different impacts of the 2 different competitive environments on the fate of the focal plant. By contrast, in the scenarios where we're looking at the leading edge of the expanding range, or the focal plant is essentially successfully migrating upslope, we find that whether it faces this novel high alpine community or its current set of competitors doesn't really matter very much for its demographic fate. And the obvious question that comes up is, why is this the case? So we spent a lot of time thinking about this, and obviously the first hypothesis that we came to was that, well, maybe the plant communities are taxonomically very different when you go from the current set of competitors down to the low elevation competitors. And maybe not so different when you go from the current competitors up to these high alpine communities. But that wasn't the case. So when we tried to compare the species composition differences across these communities, they were equally distinct from each other. There was not sort of high overlap, for example, between the high alpine systems and the mid alpine systems. That sort of ruled out that hypothesis, but that still didn't rule out another alternative, which is that even if the names of the plants are quite different when you go, for example, from the alpine system to the high alpine system, it may be that the kinds of traits that the plants possess as competitors are essentially much more similar when you go from yellow to blue than when you go from yellow to orange. So it's really not the names that matter so much, but the traits the plants possess as competitors. So to evaluate this, what we did was we went back to the field and we measured 5 different plant functional traits on a wide range of species that are found across all 3 of these different plant communities. And then we took a community weighted trait mean. We calculated a trait average for different 1 meter square sections of community, where we weighted each trait value by the abundance of the component species that had that trait in each of the communities. So essentially we took a weighted average of the trait values for all 5 traits in these 3 different communities. And here's the results of that trait analysis. So what I'm showing you is the location of plots that have been found at 2,600 meters, 2,000 meters, or down to 1,400 meters, shown by these 3 different colors, blue, yellow, then orange. I'm showing you the location in a trait space that's been defined by 5 different plant traits. So leaf size, leaf mass, the height of the whole plant, the area of the leaf per unit mass, the dry matter content of the leaf. So the point is that plant points that are close together are very similar in their essentially 5-dimensional trait values. This is projected along 2 major dimensions. And in fact, actually, it's really only the first dimension that you should focus on because it explains 76% of the variation among our communities in their community weighted trait mean values. And what you can see is that as hypothesized, there is some differences between the high alpine communities and these 2,000 meter communities along this first principal component axis. But these differences are relatively small compared to the change that you get when you go from these mid-alpine systems down to these subalpine systems that we have at 1,400 meters. So these novel low elevation competitors are indeed much more different from the current set of alpine competitors that our focal plant faces than are the high alpine communities. So this supports our sort of expectation. But of course, it's just an n of 2 or n of 1 in each of the treatments. So, it's hard to actually evaluate this in a more general way. But I think the general point that we might expect large effects of novel competitors when those competitors are functionally different in their trait values is one that hopefully is quite intuitive. Okay. So what I want to do now is turn to my second question, which is, what's the relative importance of these novel competitive interactions versus changing interactions between current competitors under warming? And I'm asking this question because it's not just the novel competitive interactions that are going to play potentially important roles in shaping species fates under climate change. And I'll come back to this even more in the final portion of the talk. We also might expect the interactions among the competitors that co-occur today to change quite markedly. And we want to get a sense of how important those changes really are, especially in comparison to the effects of whole-scale shifts in the composition of the competitive environment. Now, we can actually answer this question with the exact same set of treatments that I've already showed you, with the addition of an additional treatment that I haven't showed you. So in addition to growing our focal plants in competitive environments, either the current competitors or the novel low elevation competitors or the high alpine competitors, we also grew them with no competitors at all. And we grew them on soils that were taken from the different elevations. So we could make sure that at least when we wanted to ask how a plant grows without competition versus with competition, we were always doing so on the same soil type, which is important. But either way, what these no competition plants allow us to do, and you can see one of our bare soil plots right here in the foreground, Jeff's sort of assembling it, is we can ask, how much does competition actually suppress the growth, the biomass of our focal species? And by asking this question in different competitive and climate environments, we can actually address that second question I began, I had on the previous slide. So for example, we can ask the question in the focal plant existing in its current community with its current climate. That tells us how much competitive suppression does that plant suffer in today's world. And then we can compare the degree of competitive suppression it suffers there to what it suffers when you warm the climate, still competing with its current competitors, but now under a warmer climate. And this gives us a sense of how much warming might alter the competitive suppression this focal plant might face in the future. And then finally, we can then do the same thing, but compare the competitive suppression that's exerted by the novel low elevation community under the warmer climate. So comparing these two treatments and the effects of competition in these two different competitive and climate environments allows us to evaluate the effects of the novel competitors have that would migrate in under warmer conditions on the competitive suppression of the focal species. So the point is that we can get competitive suppression under current conditions, under current climate, under current competitors with future climate, as well as under future climate with the future competitors that might migrate in. And here's the results. So first, I'm showing you the degree of competitive suppression these four plants suffer when they face their current sets of competitors under their current climate. The y-axis of this graph is essentially how much smaller are the plants due to competition. It's a log response ratio of growth with competition versus without competition. And you can see that these species in general do suffer from competition. They're smaller. That's what the negative sign indicates to these bars. Now let's ask what happens if you keep the competitors as they currently face, but warm the system. And what we can see is that at least after 2 seasons, we find that competitive suppression has actually gone up. Not significantly so, but we do see more suppression on our 4 focal species under the warmer climate than we do under the current climate. And then last, if we look at what happens when you warm the climate and introduce the novel competitors, which of course is the scenario that we've been examining throughout this talk in a very in a more direct way, we see that here we can see that some species really have decisively, these novel competitors really are sort of the decisive factor in shaping the demographic fate of this Plantago, for example. They have a big effect on the Scabiosa. Other species, by contrast, actually show rather comparable effects of altering the sort of the climate environment of current competition versus actually bringing in whole-scale new competitors from low elevation, as you have in the red bars. But the point is that for all these plants, their competitive suppression was certainly the greatest when you warm the climate and bring in these novel low elevation competitors. Okay, so if I'm going to summarize sort of our past work in this project, it's that these novel competitors seem to shape alpine plant species responses to climate change in scenarios where the focal species fail to migrate or at the trailing edge of their range, but not when they advance their range or not at the leading edge of their range. And this is not necessarily a general truth, but in our system, it probably arises because of the different kinds of trait changes that you have in these different kinds of scenarios. But in order to make this kind of progress on this problem, we've had to make a number of huge assumptions. So we, for example, had species migrating in, perfectly in sync with climate change or failing to migrate altogether. That's actually not realistic. And were also forced to examine the competitive effects of entire communities that are found at certain elevations, not the effects of individual plant competitors, which of course is really what's going to happen as species individualistically respond to climate change. So these limitations, while they were useful for making some progress on the problem, I think have also in many ways opened up new avenues for research and probably are at the kinds of, are motivating the kinds of questions that you might have in your head right now. So in our ongoing work, we're trying to sort of shore up some of these loose ends. And in many ways, the loose ends, I shouldn't call them loose ends because they really are in many ways the million-dollar question. But the first one is, over what time scale will these novel competitors arrive? So I think I've hopefully convinced you of the fact that in the long run, once these novel competitors get there, they will play decisive roles in shaping the fates of these alpine competitors at the trailing edge of their range. But how long do we have to wait for that to happen? If we as a society, for example, really care about climate change impacts on a 50-year timescale, or maybe a generously 100-year timescale, what if these novel competitors just migrate really slowly and don't arrive for 100, 200 years? If that's the case, then really these novel competitive effects are not what we should be most focused on when we think about the fates of alpine biodiversity. We should instead be thinking about changing interactions among the current alpine competitors. So our second question really is how will the interactions among the current alpine competitors actually change with the expected pace of climate change? And this is challenging because you can't simply address the question by chunking an alpine meadow down to the future climate, because climate is not going to work in a step change. As we know, it's essentially changing gradually. It may be rapid climate change, but it still ultimately is a gradual change. And if we really want to understand the pace at which these communities are going to have an alteration of their interactions, we need to understand how biodiversity and species interactions respond to 1 degree of warming, 2 degrees of warming, 3 degrees of warming, and so on. So To address these questions, in short, what we're doing is we're parameterizing models of population spread to get at this novel competitive interaction timing, so to get a better sense of when these novel competitors are going to arrive. To examine the second question about how will these alpine communities change once the interactions among the plants that are already co-occurring with each other start to be disrupted by climate. What we're doing is we're fitting and projecting climate-dependent models of competition. And I'll show you a few slides on this before I finish up, because I think it is quite nice. This is work being led by Sebastian Bloch-Mungea, who's a PhD student in my lab here at EEB at Princeton. What we're trying to do is we're subjecting the alpine community to a gradient of warming. So we're taking plant communities that are found at around 2,000 meters and moving some back to 2,000 meters, giving them no degrees of warming, but then moving them progressively down the hill. So essentially we get, I shouldn't say progressively down the hill, we move some communities to 1 degree of warming, some to 2 degrees of warming, 3 degrees of warming, and 5 degrees of warming, and so on. And what this does is give us a nice sort of temperature gradient to begin to look at the temperature dependence of the interactions among these plants. And then to get at the interactions among the plants, we're using observational methods. So we're taking these plots. Here's one of our transplanted communities just after transplantation. We put a grid on it so that we can identify the locations of all individuals in these plots. And then what we do is painstakingly map all of the individuals in these plots at all these elevations over what's been now 4 years of censusing. So each one of these circles corresponds to an individual plant, its location, and the circle indicates its size. And then we can examine the fate of each one of these circles, each one of these individual plants, as a function of their competitive environment and their climate, to try and capture the climate dependency of their demography, as well as their competitive interactions. So the overall plan here is to basically cartoon our plant communities, which might look like this, into a series of circles where we can measure growth, we can measure mortality when individuals disappear, we can measure recruitment when new individuals show up. And we can quantify with statistical models how all of these demographic transitions depend on the neighborhood that surrounds each of these individuals. And then we have essentially a model of how these plant populations for each of these species will change as a function of climate and their competitive environment. And then we can force these models going forward with reasonable climate change scenarios that then allow us to project the future of these plant communities over time, if it's just simply changing the interactions among the plants that are found together today. And then, of course, the final part is that once we then couple these kinds of timescales of community change with the timescales of migration, we can then really get a sense of what will be the major drivers of plant community responses to climate change through these indirect effects on the 50 to 100-year timescale that's societally important. Okay, so to finish up, I just want to come back to my sort of introductory proposition that ecology is sort of at this interface or this tension between a curiosity-driven endeavor versus that that's being motivated by global environmental challenges. And I hope that I've sort of convinced you that kind of using this sort of curiosity-driven hat that I have from my training at the very least allows us to make progress on some of these problems that we might address for climate change or environmental challenge reasons in ways that are potentially quite original. So I hope that the future of ecology actually does sort of revolve around this intersection that's shown by these two arrows here. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'd like to thank my collaborators and my funding sources, as well as take any questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's fantastic. I imagine most people in the audience are going to want to join your group to go and play in the field, because it just looks like fantastic work. Super interesting, and also it looks like a lot of fun to do. So anyway, enough of my editorializing. Let me now just do my job, which is to introduce the discussant for today, Professor Corina Tarnita. Corina is also a faculty member in the EEB department, as I mentioned earlier. She broadly studies organization and patterns in ecosystems. If you want to see some of her work, she had given an earlier talk in this series. If you go back to September of last year, 2019, she gave a talk on the geometry of ecosystems in a changing world. And I'll also mention that Corina is also director of our, meaning HMEI, undergraduate program called the Environmental Studies Program, where she is doing a fantastic job. Corina, I'll turn the screen over to you to kick off the discussion and Q&A.
Great, thank you, Mike, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for this brilliant brilliant talk. The questions are already pouring in. I wanted to pick up very briefly with a question of my own as I look through all the questions that we received, and pick up from your last slide, and I guess also one of your first slides, about this inherent tension between the fundamental curiosity-driven science and the urgency to address global challenges. And I wanted to ask you, in many fields, and including in biology, you can come up with brilliant examples where extraordinary applications have rested on fundamental science, basic science advances that were not at all motivated by any kind of application. And I was just wondering what you find. So your work is a really beautiful example, but it's kind of an ongoing one. I'm wondering if you have a very established favorite example of where this tension has really played out beautifully, so that a truly fundamental science result has kind of applied for to solve a global challenge or to address a global challenge.
Yeah, so I'm going to try and answer the question two ways. And one's going to be sort of a philosophical, maybe wishy-washy way that doesn't satisfy many people. And then secondly, I'll give some concrete examples. But I think that I'll start off with the first wishy-washy way. And I think that actually that kind of what this sort of curiosity-driven endeavor provides is essentially a framework of how to think about the processes that ultimately structure natural systems. And there's really no way that I could imagine going into an applied problem that involves species, populations, and ecosystems without having that fundamental framework of what are the key links and connections that drive the fates of individual elements or species or populations that are in those systems. So I think that the best honest answer is a very diffuse one, which is that we wouldn't even be able to even approach the problem, I think, intelligently without that fundamental curiosity-driven science. But it's not, as I think you were suggesting, it's not a pointed, like, here's fundamental knowledge that simply can be picked up and applied to this environmental challenge. But I do think that we have in a narrower scope some examples within ecology where this has been done. And I think that very often, when I was thinking about this, it's often tool-based in the sense that there were tools that were developed that ultimately provide the pathways for moving forward. So I think in the conservation realm, for example, one of the best examples that I can think of sort of amazing preservation driven by ecological knowledge is sort of lawsuits that were filed by, I think it was the Sierra Club, based on work that Russ Landy did in the 80s on spotted owl habitat requirements. And what Landy was doing was basically taking a well-established principle that Levine had developed in metapopulation models that were developed abstractly in the 60s, and said, if I put some numbers on this, it'll look like an owl, it'll sound like an owl. But really, he kind of knew going in what the result was going to be, which was that you need a lot of habitat to maintain the persistence of this metapopulation, even if they're not currently occupying those locations. And so I think that's in some ways a really nice example where that kind of fundamental knowledge ultimately applies towards the preservation of the owls, but also huge stands of old growth forests that were critical for the owl's habitat at the time. And there's other examples, I think, on sort of demography and conservation that I could go into, but I think that's kind of the way to answer it most succinctly.
Thank you. I think this is really valuable for all of us to ponder, but also for the students who have been part of this talk. I think it's a question that they're probably wrestling with as they're thinking about their different classes and directions to go into. And so I'm going to move now to the many questions that we are getting. And so one of the questions, I'm going to start combining them. If they have different themes, I apologize for that, but I'm trying to reach as many, to cover as many as possible. So Bruce Leon is asking, how are the plants interacting in competition? What is exactly the mechanism of competition? Shading, extracting moisture, et cetera, physical interference. And Alexa Fredston is asking, to what extent do you really think that this is an effect of competition, the poor outcomes of the failure to migrate species, versus direct physiological effects of the warmer climate? In other words, how much did they decline in the warmer climate experiments if translated in complete isolation? So perhaps, yeah.
Okay, those are great interrelated questions. I'll answer the second one because I know the answer. But the answer is that these plants don't mind being transplanted to warmer conditions. In fact, they grow much better. So if we take these alpine plants and we bring them to lower elevations to warmer conditions, and we remove the competitors and we do it into bare plots of soil, they grow better than they do at their current elevations. So we are pretty confident that we're not looking at direct harmful effects of the climate. And importantly, even in all of these scenarios, the climate was constant across the two competitive scenarios. So, you know, whether you're looking at their current competitors or these novel low elevation competitors, the plants were warmed in both cases. So we're still looking at the relative effect of these two different competitive environments under a common climate scenario. But I can also assure you that the plants did not mind being transplanted downslope. They actually grew rather well as long as the competitors were not there altogether. But that brings up the second point, which is that, you know, what is the mechanism of the competition? And we spent a lot of time grappling with it. It's not obvious. I can say that, you know, we don't believe it's water competition for a lot of these systems because there is a ton of water, especially at some of the higher sites. They do suffer from droughts, so they're not performing well in a very, very dry year. But for most of the time, there's a lot of water available in the soil. So it kind of points towards nutrients or light, and it's probably a combination of the two, but we don't really know. I do suspect that nitrogen competition is very important, but some species definitely are being shaded out as well, especially the low elevation competitors can get quite tall, and I suspect a lot of their effect is through shading. But I don't have a definitive answer, I apologize.
Great. I'll follow up on the same thread. Mason Harrison Horde is asking, well, you're focusing on competition, but what about other kinds of interactions? What about interspecies cooperation? Each of these plant species is also reliant on interactions with other living things who might respond to climate changes differently. What happens to the various players in an interdependent ecological relationship if they respond to the changing climate in different ways?
Yeah, so that's another great question. We've obviously had that same critique of our own work. So we've been trying over the last couple of years to incorporate these mutualistic interactions into our framework. And of course, if mutualists migrate at different rates, then you end up with some very, you know, problematic outcomes for some of the players. So we've done a fair amount of work thinking about how pollinators might migrate at different rates relative to the plants. Interestingly, you can imagine that insect pollinators might not suffer the same sort of migration lags as the slower plants. And what this might mean is that we might have high elevation competitors living with pollinators that are from low elevation that migrate into these habitats. And we've been asking, for example, do the other low elevation plant competitors essentially lure those pollinators away from the high alpine plants? Can they suppress these alpine plants by luring away their mutualists? Or instead, do these low elevation pollinators just bring with them basically very effective pollination habits that might actually be good for these high alpine plants? And we've been trying to work on that problem. We did have a complete failed attempt to try and examine how soil mutualists might influence dynamics. They notoriously migrate very slowly. And you can imagine that if plants migrate without their mutualists, this could very much change the trajectory of these interactions. But we were just unsuccessful at being able to manipulate the mutualist community in the soil. But you're certainly spot on at thinking about the major limitations of what we've done already. And we're trying to address some of them, and others are just not going to be able to work for logistical reasons.
So on that note, is there a way, so Isaac Held is asking, is there a way to test your hypothesis, your predictions by looking at trends in the past? Are observed trends in species in alpine environments over recent decades well enough captured somehow so that you can test any of these?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly already ongoing responses of alpine flora to climate change that have been documented. So we see there's been amazing surveys of mountaintop alpine communities. What's being seen as a crude generalization is that a lot of species are essentially are successfully migrating up, but there hasn't been loss of species at the trailing edges of their range. So essentially, mountaintops are getting richer is one way to look at it, but there's not the depletion of diversity that you might expect at the trailing edge of these species ranges that are expanding north. And that might reflect the fact that essentially the low elevation competitors just haven't had the chance to actually exert their impacts. If that's something we're simply waiting to have happen. In terms of using sort of the paleo record, I just haven't, I've never been able to see the kind of data resolution that you would need to actually make the inferences that we'd want to make to evaluate our predictions. But it's certainly a good idea. And I think if I had a paleo ecology colleague who was thinking about these kinds of problems like we are, I suspect there would be some headway to make in that direction. But certainly we can hopefully use the ongoing responses of species to climate change as, whether it's only been a degree or whatever we have in the Alpine. This is something that we can use to our advantage when trying to understand these changes thus far.
So I will combine now some methodological and general consequences questions of your methodology from Laura Smith, Jared Roberts, and Joe Kowalik. Laura is wondering, are there consequences to these experiments that you're doing? Can it be that your plants are doing so well when you thrive so much when you transplant them in the new environment that you are basically causing the, is there a worry there? Jared is wondering if you're accounting for different levels of precipitation of the different elevations, and Joe is wondering about how you actually map out the size of so many plant individuals in a plot.
Okay, I think I can remember them.
I can read.
I got
precipitation. Yeah.
The first question is: are we potentially accelerating the migration of competitors across the Alpine and doing in these Alpine plants? We think not, because what we're doing, if you remember, is largely bringing plants down to lower elevations. We're bringing basically the wimpy Alpine competitors down to the lower elevations. So when we're introducing new species, we're bringing them down to lower habitats where they're ultimately getting, as we can see, getting pummeled by the low elevation competitors. So we don't believe we have any reason to expect that these Alpine plants are going to take over the low Alpine areas. Those are going to be even hotter and less hospitable to them in the future. And the converse, we're not bringing the low elevation competitors actually up to the high Alpine. And even if we did, they'd probably die, although we don't know that for certain. But we're not actually doing those experiments. We don't think we have huge ethical conundrums on our side for those reasons, at least. We have other ethical conundrums. But that's not something that I've seen or I'm worried about. And certainly as we let the plots go, since we stopped the experiment, they've just infilled from the edges so they're basically being depleted by the low elevation system. Another question I think was about
precipitation. Are you accounting for that? Yeah.
That's a really good question. So, when we wrote the paper, we argued that, it's not just warmer down low, it's also a little bit drier. And this is true, we think. And we argued this was sort of consistent with some of the Alpine climate change projections that exist for the region. So it wasn't just temperature, it was also moisture. But in talking with Sebastian, who's the PhD student who I mentioned towards the end of the talk, he was saying that with the weather information that he has, we're not actually seeing a major precipitation gradient across these sites. So I think there's obviously a gradient in sort of transpiration that results from the balance between the temperature and the rainfall, but or the moisture in the soil. But I don't think we're actually seeing much of a precipitation story in what I've showed you already.
And finally, I'll remind you, yeah. So Joe is asking, how do you map out the size of so many plant individuals in a plot? And I'll piggyback on that and I add my question about how do you decide what is the right size for your transplant? So you had, as you said, 0.5 square meter. How did you make that? It was how did you make that decision? But basically, yeah.
So I think Joe's question concerns the future work I described, where we are mapping individual plots. And what we do is we have size categories. And the team, as Sebastian can tell you, goes out to the field and they train each other to be consistent across what they believe the size of a plant is. So we have little templates of how big a plant is, and then they get sent to categories. We don't actually do truly continuous size. I can't remember how many there are, but there's different levels of categorical sizes that we use. So we bin them into categories. So it does mean that plants can only advance, in discrete units of size over time, which is one of the limitations of what we're doing. But we think it's a way to at least establish some consistency across investigators and across years in our analyses. But it's a good question, and we grapple with this a lot. And it's certainly our uncertainty and measurement error there is definitely contributing to annoyances in how we analyze these data. I don't doubt that. I think your question, Corina, was how big should the plots be? And we didn't really know. The first year we did the experiments, we were doing ones that were 0.5 meter square plots, so 0.7 by 0.7. And we found that if you want to do an experiment that lasts a long time, it's not a good idea because the low elevation competitors actually just migrate in from the edges pretty fast. So we now have plots that we use, and actually I showed you those pictures, they're now meter square plots. And some of the largest ones we have are actually 2 meters by 2 meters. We can't pick those up. What we did is we cut them out of the ground, like I said, in tiles, and we stacked them and kept track. There's actually a flag in the video that I showed you So we can, that actually tells us what corner we want to align them with. And then we reassemble them down below, almost like you would like an archaeological dig or something like that. So we now have 4 meter square plots, and that's as big as we can get. But even that might not be big enough. But we try and get to the point that we're dealing with essentially a self-contained set of plants that are not interacting with those that are on the outside of the system is the goal.
Very interesting. Great. So we're a bit over, but I think if you don't mind, Jonathan, maybe we can stick around for the last 3 questions. Mike, if that's okay with you. I don't know what the protocol
Yeah, I suggest maybe we take one more question, and then I will apologize for those who may not get their question answered. Perhaps if Jonathan doesn't mind, you could just send him an email. Is that I know I put you on a spot,
Absolutely.
So you can't possibly say no, of course. But
I will ignore your email. Please send it. Yeah.
So maybe we'll do one more question so we can stay close to on time, because I know everyone is has other things to do. But carry on, Corina, with pick your favorite remaining question.
I won't say my favorite.
Okay.
I'll just say one that is a little bit different, and it's about trying to expand your results to a broader, so you're talking here about flora, small plants, and so on. But what about bigger, like trees? Do you think trees which have more biomass and potential to sequester carbon would behave similarly? So how do you think about basically scaling up your results?
I don't see why not. I don't see why you would have this. And certainly going back to Isaac Held's question, I mean, some of the amazing paleo records suggest that, communities reshuffled under climate change. If you look at the past, we see that what you might view as sort of an intact endogenous set of plants that like to grow together in a forest are very different at different time points in the past. So I think that the stuff we're describing here, at least in principle, is operating in forest systems. Obviously, migration rates, in a forest system, there's the challenge that they take longer to mature, but they're also bigger. So in fact, the velocities of spread there's countervailing effects of their size versus their longevity, or the time to maturation on the eventual migration scenarios. But I don't see why in principle, anything that we describe wouldn't hold for these sort of larger carbon storing elements of the environment.
Great. Well, I'm very grateful to everyone for all these amazing questions, and to you, Jonathan, and I'll leave Mike to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Corina. That was great. Thanks everyone for the questions, and Jonathan, thank you especially to you. Terrific presentation. I'm sure the discussion, as we can see, could have gone on, but like I said, we do try to keep something close to time. So thank you, Jonathan. A terrific presentation. Corina, great job. Everyone in the audience, thank you again for joining us. I'll remind you that we will take up our seminar series again starting at the beginning of our spring semester. And the first talk we'll have will be on Tuesday, February 2nd. I'm sure you'll receive information from Morgan Kelly about our schedule, which we're in the process of putting together right now. With that, I will again thank everyone, wish everyone happy holidays, and hope that you all stay safe. Thank you.